If you are over 60 and you have been genuinely eating less, cutting portions, watching what goes on your plate, doing the things you've been told to do, and your belly fat has barely moved, you are not imagining it. And you are almost certainly not doing anything wrong.
Most people in that situation assume they're failing at discipline. They eat less, they don't see results, they assume they need to try harder. What the research actually tells us is something very different. Your body, after 60, is storing belly fat on purpose, and the mechanism driving that is not primarily controlled by how much you eat. About why after 60 matters here. This is not the same biological situation it was in your 40s. The drivers have changed. And once you understand the mechanism, the standard advice, eat less, move more, doesn't just look incomplete. In some cases, it actively works against you. I'm Marcus Reid, your senior health coach, and I'm Suki Yamamoto, wellness specialist. No fads, no miracle claims, just what the research actually shows and what it looks like in practice.
Before we get into the hormone driving this, I want to make sure we're talking about the right type of fat. Because when most people say belly fat, they mean the layer they can physically grab, the stuff around the waistline you can actually pinch.
Right, and that distinction matters a great deal. There are two distinct types of fat in the abdominal region. The first is subcutaneous fat. That's the layer directly beneath the skin. It's what you can see and feel. The second is visceral fat. That's the fat stored deep inside the abdominal cavity, packed around your organs. The liver, the intestines, the pancreas, the kidneys.
And those two types don't behave the same way?
Significantly differently. Subcutaneous fat is largely a passive energy reserve. Visceral fat is metabolically active. It behaves more like a gland than a simple storage depot. It secretes inflammatory molecules called cytokines. It produces hormones. And because it drains directly into the portal vein that feeds the liver, it has an outsized and direct effect on insulin resistance and cardiovascular risk. This is why visceral fat is the type that doctors are actually concerned about, not what's visible externally.
So the fat that's doing the most damage is the fat you can't even see.
Exactly. And the numbers around how much visceral fat changes with age are striking. Research reviewing long-term body composition data found that visceral fat increases by approximately 200% in men and around 400% in women between the 3rd and 7th decade of life. That is not a gradual drift. That is a fundamental redistribution of where the body chooses to store its energy.
400% in women. That's a biological shift, not an individual failing.
It is. And the critical question is, why? Why does the body choose this location specifically, and why does this accelerate after 60? The answer comes down to a hormone that most people have heard of, but almost nobody connects to weight. Cortisol.
When people hear belly fat and hormones, most people go straight to estrogen. That's the obvious association with menopause.
Estrogen is relevant, I'll come back to it, but it's not the primary driver of where the fat goes. The hormone that most directly instructs the body to deposit fat into the visceral compartment is cortisol. And understanding why cortisol rises after 60 requires understanding what it's actually designed to do.
Take me through it.
Cortisol is a glucocorticoid hormone. It's synthesized and released by the adrenal glands in response to stress. Any physiological stress, physical exertion, illness, pain, poor sleep, emotional pressure, caloric restriction. Its primary function is to rapidly mobilize stored energy. It raises blood glucose so that muscles in the brain have immediate fuel to respond to a perceived threat.
Classic fight-or-flight chemistry.
Precisely. And in a short-term, acute context, that response is entirely appropriate. The difficulty arises when cortisol is chronically elevated, when the stress is not something that resolves quickly, but a persistent background state the body cannot switch off. Under chronic elevation, cortisol does something very specific to fat storage. It instructs the body to preferentially deposit fat in the visceral compartment rather than subcutaneous tissue.
Why specifically there?
2 reasons. First, visceral fat cells have a significantly higher concentration of glucocorticoid receptors compared to subcutaneous fat cells. A review published in the Annals of the New York Academy of Sciences documented this receptor density difference in detail. Cortisol binds to visceral fat more efficiently, and that binding drives adipogenesis, which is fat cell growth and proliferation, specifically in that location. Second, visceral fat's position adjacent to the portal vein means that stored energy can be quickly remobilized to the liver when needed. From an evolutionary standpoint, keeping your emergency fuel reserve close to the liver is a logical design. The problem is that this system was built for short-term threats, not for the sustained low-grade stress of modern life at 60.
So we're biologically designed to store fat in our bellies when we're under pressure. That's the default setting.
That's accurate. And here is where age becomes the critical variable. After 60, and for women this begins accelerating during perimenopause, 2 things happen simultaneously that push cortisol upward. First, estrogen decline. Estrogen has a regulatory effect on the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which governs cortisol output. When estrogen falls, that regulatory brake weakens. Cortisol responses to stress become amplified, and recovery from those cortisol spikes slows down.
So you're reacting more intensely to stress, and it takes longer for the cortisol to clear.
That's a precise summary. Research published in the journal Menopause found that postmenopausal women show measurably greater cortisol reactivity to psychological stressors than premenopausal women of comparable age and fitness levels. This is not a personality trait or a coping failure. It is a measurable biological change that happens as estrogen declines.
And the second thing, you said 2 things happen simultaneously.
The second is sleep disruption. This is the one most people don't connect to belly fat at all. Research published by the Mayo Clinic in 2022 demonstrated that insufficient sleep directly increases visceral fat accumulation, independently of dietary intake. Participants restricted to 4 hours of sleep per night for 2 weeks showed a statistically significant increase in visceral fat compared to the group sleeping 8 hours, while consuming identical diets.
Not because of eating more, purely from the sleep loss.
Correct. Sleep deprivation elevates cortisol, particularly during the second half of the night, when cortisol should be at its lowest point. And slow-wave sleep, the deep restorative phase that naturally declines with age, is the phase most responsible for cortisol regulation. So even when older adults achieve adequate total sleep time, the architecture of that sleep may not be providing the cortisol resetting function it once did.
So poor sleep isn't just making you tired. It's actively feeding the fat storage cycle.
That is exactly what the evidence shows.
Okay, so cortisol is elevated. From estrogen decline, from poor sleep, from chronic low-grade stress. I think most people at this point are thinking, fine, I'll cut my calories harder and push through.
And this is exactly where I want to be careful. Because in the presence of a chronically elevated cortisol environment, aggressive caloric restriction can trigger the precise hormonal response you're trying to avoid.
Wait, eating less makes it worse?
Not universally, and I want to be precise about this because it's a nuanced point. Severe or rapid caloric restriction is itself a physiological stressor. It signals to the body that food supply is scarce. That signal is a threat, and threats activate the adrenal response. Cortisol rises. When cortisol rises, it elevates blood glucose because it's trying to make energy available quickly. That elevated blood glucose triggers an insulin response, and now you have high cortisol and high insulin simultaneously. That combination is a specific, potent signal to deposit fat into the visceral compartment.
So the chain is, you eat less, Your body reads it as a threat, cortisol goes up, blood sugar rises, insulin spikes, and you end up storing more visceral fat. The opposite of the intended outcome.
That can be the outcome, yes. And here is what the research demonstrates about why this matters specifically for this demographic. A 2014 study published in Psychoneuroendocrinology, conducted by researchers at the University of California, San Francisco, including the stress physiology researcher Elissa Epel, examined chronically stressed postmenopausal women. They found that in women with an elevated baseline cortisol profile, the combination of chronic stress and consumption of energy-dense food produced significantly greater visceral fat accum.
Same food, different stress environment, different visceral fat outcome.
That is what the data showed. Which tells us something important. The hormonal context in which you eat is altering what the body does with that food. The calorie equation is real, but it is incomplete without the hormonal denominator.
I always thought stress eating was the mechanism, that stressed people just end up eating more.
That's a common framing, and it's partially supported. Stress does influence food choices and appetite. But the more important finding is that the cortisol environment itself, independent of caloric intake, is reconfiguring where the body sends the energy it already has. This is why the standard advice so reliably fails this specific population. It addresses one variable in a multivariable equation, and people blame themselves when the advice doesn't produce results.
Which is the worst possible outcome, because then they try harder at the thing that isn't working.
Precisely.
So if eating less alone is insufficient, and in some cases counterproductive, what does the evidence actually support?
Let me give you 4 specific areas where the research is reasonably consistent, and I'll be clear about which ones have stronger evidence and which are more preliminary, because that nuance matters. The first, and the most underused, is sleep quality. Not sleep duration as an abstract target, but specifically achieving the deep restorative sleep phases that allow cortisol regulation to function properly. The most useful first step for many people in this situation is not a dietary change. It is a clinical conversation about sleep. Sleep apnea is significantly underdiagnosed in women over 60 because in women it often presents not as loud snoring but as insomnia, frequent night waking, morning fatigue, and mood disruption. If sleep architecture is compromised, no downstream intervention addresses the upstream cortisol problem. You are managing symptoms while the driver continues unchecked.
Sleep first, before the food changes, before the exercise program.
That is my position based on the evidence hierarchy, yes. Fix the cortisol regulation problem at the root before managing its downstream effects.
What's the second area?
The type of movement, not just the quantity. This is important. Long, intense aerobic sessions, particularly in people who are already in an elevated cortisol state, can sustain or worsen cortisol elevation rather than reducing it. What the evidence supports specifically for visceral fat reduction in postmenopausal women is resistance training. A 2023 systematic review and meta-analysis published in Frontiers in Endocrinology, which synthesized data from multiple exercise intervention trials, found that resistance training produced significant reductions in visceral fat in postmenopausal women. A separate 15-week resistance training study published in Maturitas demonstrated measurable reductions in abdominal adiposity, specifically in women undergoing menopausal transition.
So the conventional advice, just do more cardio to burn belly fat, is not the right prescription here.
For this specific population, with this specific mechanism, that advice is incomplete. Resistance training builds and preserves muscle mass, which improves insulin sensitivity, which directly dampens the insulin-cortisol fat storage loop. That's the mechanism. Walking and moderate aerobic activity remain beneficial for other reasons, but resistance training needs to be a primary modality, not an afterthought.
And the third?
Eating pattern rather than eating quantity. The evidence here is around the composition and timing of meals and their effect on the cortisol-insulin interaction. Foods that produce large, rapid glucose spikes, refined carbohydrates eaten in isolation, ultra-processed foods, high glycemic meals without fiber or protein to slow absorption, generate larger insulin responses. In the presence of elevated cortisol, those amplified insulin responses accelerate visceral fat deposition. Shifting toward whole foods, fiber-rich vegetables, and adequate protein slows the glucose curve and reduces the amplitude of each insulin response. This is not about eating less. It is about eating in a way that doesn't repeatedly fire the accelerator on a cycle that is already running too fast.
Not restriction, reducing the spike.
And it tends to be more sustainable because it doesn't trigger the starvation cortisol response. Your body is not reading it as a threat.
And the fourth?
The fourth is what I would call HPA axis recovery, and I want to be transparent that the research here, while promising, is more early stage than the first three. These are the practices that appear to directly downregulate the cortisol output system itself. In the literature, the interventions with the most consistent evidence are slow diaphragmatic breathing, specifically exhale extended breathing, where the exhale is twice the length of the inhale, practiced for 10 to 20 minutes daily. This activates the parasympathetic nervous system and has been shown in several well-controlled trials to measurably reduce salivary cortisol. Yoga, not primarily as exercise, but specifically the combination of controlled breath and movement, shows similar parasympathetic activation effects. And social connection, which I know sounds like it belongs in a different category. Human social engagement, the kind that involves genuine face-to-face interaction, produces measurable reductions in cortisol in aging adults. This is not a supplement, it is not a workout, and it is not optional wellness advice. It is addressing the upstream driver directly.
People will hear slow breathing and social connection and assume we're not being serious.
I understand why. We dismiss things that don't cost money and don't fit into the supplement or fitness equipment paradigm. But the research supports these interventions. The dismissal is cultural, not scientific.
So when you walk into your GP's office, what do you actually ask for?
3 specific things. First, a diurnal cortisol assessment, ideally a 4-point salivary cortisol test that measures levels in the morning, midday, afternoon, and evening. A single fasted blood cortisol reading is an incomplete picture of what the axis is doing across the day. Second, a conversation about sleep quality, and specifically whether a sleep study is appropriate, particularly if you experience night waking, morning fatigue, or any symptoms that might suggest sleep apnea. Third, ask whether any current medications may be interacting with cortisol regulation. Several medications commonly prescribed for blood pressure and inflammatory conditions interact with the cortisol pathway. This is a reasonable conversation to have. You do not need to arrive with a diagnosis. You arrive with the right questions.
Let me close the loop. The reason belly fat after 60 resists conventional approaches is not a calorie problem. It's a cortisol problem. Cortisol rises after 60 because estrogen decline weakens the HPA axis, because sleep architecture deteriorates, and because the body has a lower threshold for sustained stress responses. Elevated cortisol tells visceral fat cells, which have a significantly higher density of cortisol receptors than other fat cells, to accumulate. It raises blood glucose, which drives insulin up, and that cortisol-insulin combination is a specific signal to deposit fat in the abdominal organs. Aggressive caloric restriction, when the body reads it as a stressor, can raise cortisol further and worsen the cycle.
What the evidence supports. Prioritize sleep quality first and have the clinical conversation if you're not achieving restorative sleep. Add resistance training as your primary movement modality, not instead of walking, but as a core element of your week. Manage the glucose curve of your diet rather than reducing volume aggressively. And do not dismiss the HPA recovery practices: slow breathing, movement with a parasympathetic component, genuine social engagement. They address the driver, not just the downstream effects, and the research supports them.
This is the conversation that should be happening, and mostly isn't. If this was useful, the like button genuinely helps more people find it. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss next week. We're going back to the skin pillar, and specifically to something that most people blame entirely on aging, when the underlying mechanism is actually quite different.
We'll see you then.